I believe that issues of sex, sexuality, gender should be openly discussed in the Orthodox Church today, for at least two reasons. First of all, because they are a reality, and secondly, because I think the Orthodox Church, at its best, has always tackled difficult questions.
I think gender and sex issues have long been a part of the Orthodox Church's discussion. Maybe not as much in the modern age as we'd like to be, but I think it's really critical that we have these. The discussion influences everybody around us. I mean, our youth are influenced by it. Everybody is influenced. I think without that discussion, actually, we're missing a vital component of what the Church should be doing.
The Orthodox Church is not a secret society. It does not possess special information or data which is unavailable to other people. It's a discursive society in which truth is arrived at together. And so it's essential that the world and the wider church can see this conversation taking place on what are the most controversial and pressing pastoral issues of the contemporary age.
Issues of gender and sexuality have to be discussed openly in the church, simply because they're so much of a pressing issue in our society. And everyone in the church is also a member of the secular world and is facing these issues every day.
The basic teaching within the Orthodox Church on sexuality is, in my view, not controversial at all. It's very clear. We teach that sexuality is a gift from God and that it can be a source of grace and holiness, but it is to be used only within the sacrament of marriage between a man and a woman. Now, that teaching, in my view, has not changed, but that, of course, means that all sexual activity, whether heterosexual or homosexual, outside marriage is, in the teaching of the Orthodox Church, not approved of. And that's where the problems arise, that this is challenged by the society around us, and how far should we conform to the standards of the secular world in which we're living.
They are controversial, and they're becoming more controversial because Orthodoxy is encountering modernity. It is, in its liturgical consciousness, it hasn't really changed. Its basic liturgical texts and its spirituality and its theology have by and large remained the same, and they were in a way put down into print and published in the beginning of the early modern period. And so they reflect, as it were, a lost universe. And this still goes on. But we are now, as it were, thrown or thrust into a late modern, a late form of capitalism, which has all these different challenges, hyper-individualism, hyper-rationalism, and Orthodoxy is no exception. It has to deal with these difficulties, and there are major controversies, because how do you remain true to the tradition of the Orthodox Church but still deal with the fact of these major issues and the existence of LGBTQ plus people who are Orthodox and who wish to be full members of that communion.
One reason that issues of gender and sexuality are so controversial is that Orthodoxy as a global religion comes from so many different cultural contexts. And within each of those, the Church is not somehow removed from the surrounding environment. It's dependent upon those values and shaped by them, and then also in turn shapes the society around it. And it's also steeped in a historical tradition where things like same-sexual relationships had very different meanings from how they're understood in a modern context. So things like gender and sexuality within marriage, outside of marriage, the age for marriage and sexual practices has shifted so much throughout the history of Christianity, and I don't think Orthodox Christianity has done a sufficient job in keeping up with that conversation in a way that has been consistent. So there's some fracturing that goes on. Additionally, there are people that have come into Orthodox Christianity specifically because they see it as a place that reflects conservative values, social values. And they might be leaving, in terms of conversion, leaving another religion behind and finding some sort of refuge within Orthodox Christianity as some place that reflects certain political and social positions that they find appealing. And for those individuals, it's very problematic then for the church to take a more liberal standpoint. But there certainly are pockets within Orthodox Christianity that see the primacy of love and care for the individual person in a way that would result in an inclusion, greater level of inclusion and acceptance.
What has struck me, I suppose, most of all is that the Orthodox Church is coming rather late to a debate that's been raging in other churches for a much longer time, probably because the Orthodox churches are more rooted in Eastern Europe, which only slowly has had to confront the issues raised in the West. But I think what's most struck me in the conference, if I was really honest, is the two things that don't really easily relate to each other are coming into confrontation, that people are profoundly committed to Orthodox spirituality and asceticism, but sometimes also they want to relate to modern norms, and perhaps there's a very, very understandable sort of pastoral sense of we've got to deal with these people's problems. But I think perhaps an insufficient critical investigation into why people have those problems and whether those problems are really the problems that people think they're having. And to my mind, that's probably rooted in the end in something an Orthodox theologian, Andrew Louth, has said, and that in some ways the Orthodox Church has a very, very strong tradition of asceticism, but perhaps a rather weaker tradition of reflection on how secular people are supposed to live, secular ethics, secular politics, secular justice. And so I think for that reason, possibly the Orthodox Church finds it even harder to mediate these debates than the Catholic Church does or the Protestant churches.
Issues of gender, sex, and sexuality are so controversial in the Orthodox Church, primarily because there's been such an openness in Western countries. And the churches feel somewhat threatened that any kind of openness to discussing those issues would be a kind of watering down of their tradition, a kind of surrendering to perhaps atheist secularism. But that really is not the case because, again, you know, there should and can be discussions within the Orthodox Church that don't necessarily threaten the dogmatic non-negotiables.
The controversies that take place today in the Orthodox Church and are experienced within circles of discussions, I feel is simply the manifestation of a very natural process of assessing, digesting, and waiting for the outcome to come.
So with regard to the questions we're discussing, gender, sex, sexuality and so on, and what remains to be discussed, and what are the big challenges in what remains to be discussed, I suspect it's almost everything. You know, we're having to think about ourselves. But it's not even just questions of what is it to be male, female, where does gender, sexuality fit into it. Increasingly, the question is what is it to be human? You know, in an increasingly transhumanist, post-humanist society, well, what is it to be a human being anyway? So, many fundamental questions remain.
I don't know that the Orthodox Church has been conclusive in addressing any question related to gender and sexuality. And the ways that it has are, by modern standards, problematic. So, for example, there's a strong element of androcentrism, patriarchy within our tradition, and I think those are becoming challenged in a modern context in a way that's very beneficial for the theological consistency of the Church. So I think there's a lot of questions that are being raised, and there's no question that's too challenging or too dangerous that the Church shouldn't address.
Where does Orthodoxy fall in terms of modernity? As I have been writing and talking, I've mentioned that sexual diversity. This is just an iconic issue. It's the tip of, as it were, a hermeneutic iceberg that Orthodoxy must encounter with modernity. You also have religious diversity. You also have issues such as episcopal, which is to say the bishop's authority in a democratic ethos. You have technology. How is Orthodoxy going to respond to the modern West as, in some ways, a pre-modern tradition? But how is it going to respond to what is Western, while remaining distinctively Eastern?
One of the big questions to be answered is in regard to gender, sex, and sexuality has to do with the dysphoria. I think is one of the most important ones. What happens when a person has a given body, biology, and yet also has a given aversion or a sense that they are disconnected from that body and biology. And how do we, from an Orthodox Christian view, how do we account for that? How do we come to a sense that we're trying to come to an account between the way that the givenness of our current state and how to address that state when it seems to be pitted and warring against itself.
There are so many questions and challenges that regarding sex, gender, and sexuality that the Orthodox churches need to continue to address. We're only beginning this discussion. There's issues in terms of how to pastorally care for people within the church, the more theoretical, theological issues. There's also the political issues, the way the churches are using this, especially within the Eastern European countries, as this kind of red line, this kind of dividing line over and against a kind of an imagined sort of liberal secularism, in my opinion, and whether in fact to use this particular issue as this kind of geopolitical a way of configuring relationships, I think is all these questions are still things that very much need to be discussed within the Orthodox churches.
Well, what I found unique about this particular meeting is the variety of people who are engaged. We have everyone from conservative clerics to secular philosophers to activists in the LGBT movement. And I think it's a wonderful conversation to get such different groups together and let them listen to one another.
What I note as different is the quality of togetherness of people from lots of different countries and from quite different backgrounds, with a mixture of really quite conservative and really quite liberal opinions, having been able to share space so far at least, and not long may it continue, charitably.
Well, I think what was unique and distinctive about this meeting was, on the one hand, the breadth of the contributions, the openness of the conversation that took place, the quality of those contributions, in the sense that the contributors were experts in their field. They were very informed contributions, but also very sort of personal contributions, in the sense that people were deeply involved in what they were saying, both as researchers but also as members of the church and as Christians and fundamentally as human beings. And I think overall there was a consensus that we met to try and ask the difficult questions and to face those difficult questions and the difficult answers that stem from them. And I think that is unique. It involves a degree of vulnerability on both sides of this conversation. And I think that's quite rare these days.
I am very grateful to be here at this conference, and I have had my imagination stretched by many of the things that have been said, though I don't always agree with them. So I think it is valuable that in a responsible way we Orthodox should take part in the dialogue that's going on in all the other Christian churches.
I hope that this meeting will provide overall a space in which people who usually don't meet can meet together, and that they can begin to build relationships of trust, which mean that they don't see one another as the enemy or some kind of embodiment of strawman positions, but as real people with real concerns, which are deeply held and often formed from deep reflection. And so this is a space for that encounter to take place.
Right now, I don't think we're likely to see the Orthodox Church make big pronouncements, big changes in its approach. In fact, I would say the Orthodox Church doesn't make many pronouncements anyway. But bringing people together to discuss all sides of an issue, that dialogue needs to begin and needs to be continued over and over again.
What I hope can be gained through this meeting is the beginning of a process of being able to talk with peace, with love, with compassion, and listen to people of differing opinions. And particularly, I would hope that there is a process where Orthodox can begin, particularly Orthodox such as myself, who are clerics, listen to people who self-identify as LGBTQ+, and hear their stories and understand their pain, and entering into a position of deep pastoral compassion for them. Now, I don't believe that I in any way have the authority to be able to, and wouldn't try to change the teaching of the Orthodox Church. But that doesn't mean that I do not have an obligation to love people where they are, and hear them, and listen to their voice. At the same time that I am a witness to the extent to which I can, to the mind of the Church and to its traditions. And so this is a process. It has to begin somewhere, and I hope that it begins here.